So we started this module off with this motivating question, which was how does the allocation of resources affect the economic well-being of different market participants? So we looked at consumer surplus, which is the value to buyers minus the amount paid by the buyers, right? Another name for these things is willingness to pay and price. And then we define producer surplus, which is the amount received by sellers minus the cost to the sellers, also known as price and cost. So now we want to look at the aggregate welfare of the whole market. And our metric for that is simply total surplus, which is going to be consumer surplus plus the producer surplus, which is the value to the buyer, which is the willingness to pay, minus amount paid by the buyer, which is price, plus producer surplus, which is amount received by sellers, which is also price, minus the cost to sellers or cost. So total surplus, right, you can see in the middle, the two prices cancel out. It's just willingness to pay minus cost, or the value to the buyer minus the cost to the seller. And graphically, we can identify the total surplus. We know how to identify consumer and producer surplus. So if the price is 30, this is our equilibrium quantity demanded. And we know that this area is our producer surplus, and this area is our consumer surplus. And if we wanted to, we could calculate the area of both of these triangles. You just do each one separately as a right triangle and then add them together. But what we'd really like to know is what is the allocation that maximizes both the consumer and producer surplus, or the total surplus, because that's going to be the allocation that produces the greatest welfare to the market participants. And so what we want to look for is what we call an efficient allocation. And an efficient allocation is just one that maximizes the total surplus. So I'll make this claim here that the market finds the efficient allocation. And so let's look and see if that is actually the case. So the market allocation, right, is where supply meets demand. So price of 30 and quantity demanded of 15 is what the market says our allocation should be. So let's say instead of a allocation of 15 for our quantity demanded, let's say it's 20. Well, at 20, the sellers have a cost of about 40, and the buyers have a willingness to pay that's only about 25. So if a transaction takes place out here, you're going to have negative surplus, right? So if the buyer pays 40 but only values the good at 25, they get a negative consumer surplus, and the seller gets zero surplus. And if the seller sells it at 25, the consumer gets zero surplus, but the seller gets negative 15. So any additional transaction past the equilibrium value is going to reduce the total surplus. Every transaction that takes place to the right of this equilibrium point is generating negative surplus. On the other hand, let's say the quantity demanded is 10 for the sake of argument. Well, at 10, consumers have a willingness to pay of 40, and the sellers have a willingness to sell, or a cost, of 25. So in this case, there's deals being left on the table, right? We can still transact up to 10 units, because at a price of 30, 30 is above the producer's cost up to 10 units, and 30 is below the producer's willingness to pay up to 10 units. But we end up missing out on all this area of surplus. These are deals or transactions that would have taken place but aren't for whatever reason. And so you can increase total surplus by moving from 10 to 15 and capturing the surplus represented by this triangle. So in short, any allocation or any point on the graph that's not where supply meets demand is going to have a lower total surplus than the market allocation. So that's the upshot of this module, that markets efficiently allocate resources to maximize the total well-being of everyone involved in the market. There is exceptions, which we'll talk about in the future, which is when you have a market failure, and we'll address those situations and what to do when the market isn't functioning properly.